Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about power spikes in League. You probably heard the term before, but might not quite understand how to tell when you're hitting a power spike, or you may not have heard the term before of a power trough. And so let's kind of talk about what this is and how you can understand this in League. So your average player is probably going to understand your power level in League as kind of a linear progression upwards. That as the course of the game goes on, you get stronger and stronger over time. And while this is true, on a very zoomed out scale, it's not actually what's going on. Instead, our power level in League looks something more like a staircase where we're hitting a level and getting an increase in power on our champion, or we're going back to base and we're buying an item and becoming stronger. And this is more similar to what our power level actually looks like in League. Now, imagine that we're beating our opponent, and so our opponent is, a little bit behind the curve here. They're like this. But there are points in the game where they go back and buy an item, or they hit a level, and even though in general they're lagging behind, it shouldn't go down. Even though they're lagging behind, there are points where they are going to go back while we haven't. Again, it should not go down. And they're going to end up with a couple of points. And these sections here are basically this opportunity for them, where they're at the same power level as us, or basically the same power level as us, and they have an opportunity to make something happen because they're actually just as strong as us at these points throughout the game. So this is, not the best drawing in the world. It's not my strong suit, but you get the idea here. Is that power level in League is not just this linear constant growth. Your champion hits, level 1, and we'll get even more granular with this, right? So realistically, if we think about the way that a game goes, we're going to get a really big spike up in power level from going from level 1 to 2 because we've just doubled the abilities that our champion has access to. Then we're going to get another really big power spike from level 2 to level 3 because, well, maybe not as big because we're only adding one ability out of 3, so it's probably not as big as the level 2 jump. It's still really big compared to all the other levels where we're not getting access to an ability. So you can imagine that hitting level 2 is a really big power spike because you're nearly doubling the power level of your champion. Then level 3, adding that additional ability is going to give you maybe, this might be 100% increase. Level 3 might give you it would be a little bit more because you're also going to get stats from leveling up, but this might give you a 33% increase in power level. And then you're going to get less because once you're hitting level 4 and level 5, you're not adding a whole extra ability, so you're just getting the stats that you're getting. And so these might be, depending on how many stats you're getting, maybe these little 10% increases or so in your power level. But then when you hit level 6, you get access to a whole new ability again, and it's usually quite a powerful one. So maybe your power level at level 6 spikes really hard again, and you get more of like a 50%, or maybe even depending on your champion, how powerful your ult is. Maybe even in a fight, it's potentially even, more than a 50% increase in your power level. Again, these are just hypothetical numbers. It's going to depend on the champion, and it's going to depend on the situation. But you're going to see huge power level increases at level 2, here at level 6, and at level 3. Whereas, just putting points in between is not that big of a deal. Now, as we keep going out, when we're talking about levels, when we get to level 9, we have our first ability max, so you might think that there's a big power spike at level 9 when we complete maxing our first ability. But you don't actually really get anything extra for finishing maxing your first ability than you get for putting points into it at level 4, at level 5, et cetera, at these in between levels. So you don't actually get a power spike at level 9. Now at level 11, you get 2 points into your ult. And depending on the champion, this could be either a really big power spike. Let's say you're playing a damage champion, and getting that extra point in your ult increases the amount of damage that you can do in an all-in. quite significantly, then this could be, quite a big power spike. It's not going to be as much as these early power spikes because you have a lot of power invested in other parts of your kit, but you might see, let's just call it, so we have numbers that demonstrate this, higher than your average level, maybe like a 20% increase in the power level of your champion when you spike at level 11. And so, but this is going to depend on the champion. There are some champions where it's not even worth putting a second point into their ult, because actually their ult does basically the same thing whether they put a point into it or not. So a lot of times when you get level 11 and you get a second point into your ult, it's going to represent putting a point into your ult mostly to decrease the cooldown, is mostly what getting a point in it is going to matter. Because when you have a champion, what's the most difficult part of your ult, or the most problematic part? It's that it's on a gigantic 60, 70, 80 second cooldown for a lot of champions. So getting that second point into ult on a champion when it takes 20 or 30 seconds off of the ult is going to increase the frequency at which you can ult, and that's where you're going to get a lot of the power level increase from. Now the damage is nice, but don't be confused. If your ult goes up 200 damage, right, but you're and putting a point into your Q makes your Q damage go up even just 50 or 100 damage, because you're going to Q way more than 4 times in the time that you're going to ult, you actually get more damage from putting your point into your Q, let's say. So you have some champions like Tryndamere that are not going to put points into their ult at all. It's a little bit rare, but there are champions that are just not going to put a second point into their ult, because Tryndamere's ult doesn't benefit from cooldown reduction. There's nothing on that. And, it does basically the same thing whether he's put a second point into it or not. And so there are a few champions that actually just decline putting a point into their ult because they don't get the cooldown reduction, or maybe let's say the extra damage, or in, if it was Tryndamere's case, no extended duration or something like that, that would really represent a big increase in power level. And so putting a second point in Tryndamere would be, maybe this 5% or 10% increase, and you're just better off maxing your other abilities. So it is rare, but there are some champions that are just not going to put a second point into ult because they don't actually get the benefit from way more damage in an all-in, or greatly reduced cooldown. If you are the majority of champions that are putting a second point into ult, it's going to be a power spike for sure, but maybe not as big as the other ones, because most of it's not coming from all-in power or extra damage. Depending on the champion, most of it's coming from getting the cooldown down. So it's a little bit big, but it's not that big compared to these other spikes early, obviously. When it comes to levels, we also have the same thing right at level 16. At level 16, again, it's going to end up being smaller than this, but probably bigger if you've got a huge cooldown off of your off of your ability. You could see getting level 16 having more of an impact than your average generic level here at let's say like level, again, we were talking about like level 4 or level 5. But this is another thing that's important to note. So actually level 4, level 5 are not equal to, let's say, some random other levels. So let's say like 12 through 15 here. Let's talk about why that is, like why these would be like 10%, but these might actually be lower, like 5%. The reason for that is because once you get to level 12 through 15, the majority of your champion stats are coming from items, and you've gotten so many levels that these stats that you're getting when you level up don't represent a big increase. So let's just talk about HP as an example of that. Let's say that we have 700 HP when we hit when we're like level 3, and then when we hit level 4, let's just say we go up to like 800 HP. This represents quite a big increase in your total HP. It's more than 10%. I didn't pick very nice numbers, huh? But you're going 100 on 700, so you get the idea. I mean, you're going 100 HP on 700 HP is like 14.3%. So you're seeing like this big 14% increase in your HP, and that's a nice spike. Whereas if you go from like level 11 to level 12, and you go from like, I don't know, 2000 HP and you get the same 100 per level. So now you go to 2,100 HP. This represents, instead of 14.28%, this represents, kind of sad I can't tell you that off the top of my head right now, a little bit out of it. 100 out of 2,000 is 5%. So this is a 5% increase in your HP. This same flat amount of HP, but it's a 14% increase. So when we talk about these level spikes here, keep in mind that basically the earlier level you are, the bigger the spike is going to be. So level 4 is going to be greater than level 5, even if it's a generic level. It's going to be greater than level 7. It's going to be greater than level 8. Right? It's going to be greater than level 9. It's going to be greater than level 10. Then we've got a big power spike at level 11 when we get our ult. And then 10 is going to be greater than hitting level 12, greater than hitting level 13, etc., etc., etc. Now, another thing that's worth noting about this actually is that the other thing that's important is that you tend to max your most important abilities, or the abilities that you get the most from maxing first. A little bit in the way here, but you get the idea. So when you go to max an ability, just like we talked about whether it's worth putting a point into your ult, you're going to consider things like just very basic stuff, but depends on the champion. How much damage do I get out of maxing this ability? How much damage do I get out of maxing this ability? And how much cooldown am I shaving off of the ability? So a lot of times when you decide to max an ability in League, cooldown is going to be really important, because even if you get, again, let's say you have an ability that does 200 damage flat, or and you get like an additional 50 for every point that you put into it. 200 is too much. Let's call it 100. A lot of abilities do around 100 when you just have 1 point in the ability. Let's say that you get 50 points into it, or 50 damage every time you put a point into it. So that's basically representative of a 50% increase in its power level. But if you halved the cooldown, you would do double the damage. So you'd need to put 2 points into it to be able to go from doing 100 damage to 200 damage for it to be worth decreasing the cooldown by half. So cooldown's pretty important, damage is pretty important. It depends on the type of champion. Obviously, me as like a tank support player, cooldown is going to matter a lot for whether I'm maxing an ability or not. Maybe for a damage champion, obviously like more damage is going to matter a little bit more, or whichever between cooldown and damage is maximizing your damage output is going to be the one that matters the most. But think about this, right? Since I'm choosing to max, Q first, because it gives me the most damage and the most cooldown off, I'm choosing to max Q because let's just say on this champion, hypothetical champion, maxing Q, then W, and then E gives me the most benefit. That means that I'm putting points into Q level 1 through 9, so I'm getting the most value out of the points that I'm getting to put into my basic abilities at level 1 through 9 into Q. Then when I'm maxing my other abilities, and again, forgive me, I forget a little bit because you have to put 1 point into another ability here, so you end up with like 2 points in your secondary ability or something like that. So I'm not sure exactly when you finish it. Is it like here? It doesn't really matter. The point is the same, right? Which is that you're getting from this earlier group of levels not only more of a percentage increase in your stats, but you're also getting to max the ability that's giving you the most value first. So you, even though it's a generic singular skill point that's going to give you the same thing as the next generic skill point that you put into that generic ability, it's still going to give you more value when you're maxing your most valuable ability first. Then you're going to lose a little bit value once you start maxing your second most valuable ability, and then you're going to lose a little bit more value for those points that you're putting in as you max your third most valuable ability here. So that's the concept when it comes to levels, right? So I hope that helps you guys understand how power spikes work in relation to levels. So you're going to see very, on a very detailed basis, each level. Just to recap really quickly, level 2, gigantic power spike. You're going to double your ability, I was going to say your ability power, but the power level of your abilities is going to double more or less. Not quite, because actually, again, same concept. Your first ability is probably more impactful than the second ability you choose to put a point into. So maybe not quite as powerful as your first ability. For some champions, it may be. Maybe you're having access to that second ability is just as powerful as having access to the first. In that case, it would be. If you're a champion, let's say like Braum, actually, who has a lot of power from already having access to his passive level 1, and then you've got your Q, gaining access to a second ability maybe isn't that big of a power spike, but then you also have the biggest percentage increase in the bonus you're getting from stats. So regardless of the exact amount, huge level 2 power spike, right? Pretty decent level 3 power spike. And then, as we saw here, level 4, all these generic levels where you're just putting 1 point into a generic ability is much smaller than these other breaking points that are worth noting. But, keep in mind that the earlier levels are more important, because the percentage increase in your stats that you're getting when you level up at those early points is going to be more than later on. You're getting to put points into your most important ability, which is going to be really good and maximize your damage more than when you're putting points into your third most useless ability later on. And then you're going to experience a big power spike at level 6, gaining access to your ultimate, and then a moderate power spike depending on your champion when you hit level 11 and level 16, as you get to put an extra point into your ult and maybe greatly increase the frequency at which you can use your ult, or the damage, or both. But again, that can depend on the champion. There are a few niche champions that actually will not put a second point into their ultimate, or a third point into, well, eventually you'd put them in. But because of that, those champions would, be experiencing more of this default generic curve as they're putting those points into other abilities. But that's not, maybe Trendemir's the only champion that I can think of off the top of my head that does that, but there's probably others. And probably should be done more frequently. It's something that people have started thinking about. One other thing I'll say here about putting points into abilities real quick, just while we're on the topic. A lot of times, it's a place that hits close to home. In support, we talked about the value that you're getting from, let's say, this, maxing your most important ability first, then your second most important ability second. Something that should be done a lot more frequently, like deciding whether it's worth actually putting a second point in your ult, is really, really important on support. A lot of times you're going to be maxing a damage ability in lane. Oops, that's a B. You're going to be maxing a damage ability in lane, and when you get out of lane, you're going to be maxing some sort of defensive ability. Might as well have not written it out. So you're going to be maxing a damage ability, and then you're going to be maxing, let's say, a defensive ability. You see this on champions like enchanters, like let's say a Lulu, who might actually look to well, I don't know that I would max Q on Lulu. Actually, you might max E. Let's say like Janna, right? A lot of Janna players might max W in lane and then transition to maxing E out of lane. On Braum, you max Q for damage in lane and then transition to maxing E out of lane. On Karma, you put points into Q and then transition to maxing E once you're out of lane. And what I mean by that is, it can be okay as the game transitions and your playstyle and the way you're using your abilities shifts. It can be good, but it's not something a lot of people think about, to only put, let's say, 3 or 4 points into your Q on Braum, Karma, or your W on Janna, your damage ability, to poke and to be able to fight and win lane, and then transition to maxing E on Braum, or E on Janna, or E on Karma, their defensive abilities, their shields, once you're out of lane, because those become the more important prominent ability once you're out of lane. And so that's something that's really important to keep in mind, that Braum doesn't need to be investing in damage once he's out of lane and relying on the rest of his team, and neither does Janna or Karma. Karma especially, right, is going to transition from ult queuing, using that mantra Q in lane to poke and to get ahead in lane, to using mantra on her E. And so it's, even more important that she's going to get a lot more value if she starts switching to that. So it's not so generic that level 1 through 9, you have to max one ability and finish it all the way out. If you've got two abilities that are very similar in power level, it can be okay to put a point into one or the other. Or to like transition into another one once you get out of lane, especially on support, because we see that, case scenario change very clearly for support once lane is over. In some cases, it can even be worth it, but this is pretty high level. But in some cases, it can even be worth it to invest a point into an ability because you're in combat and that ability is off of cooldown, whereas the other ability is on cooldown. Now, not ideal. Ideally, you would have seen that you're about to level up and been able to hold on to the ability you wanted to originally put the point into anyways. But obviously, if you're in like a life or death scenario and you already used your Q, but now you've leveled up and have a point to put in and your E's up, and putting a point in your E is going to give you extra damage, and it was a second ability you were going to max anyways, just throw the point into E if you're in a life or death situation and you think it has a decent chance of making a difference on the situation. So it's not always correct here. We've just mentioned it with the ult, with transitioning from putting a couple of points into your damage ability to then maxing like a defensive ability, especially on support, or to putting a point in an ability because you're in a combat situation. That's the only ability you have up and you think it'll turn the tide of the fight. These are all situations where non-traditional orders of maxing your abilities can matter. So that's a little bit of a different topic because it's not quite power spikes, but I hope that gives you a better idea of, thinking about how you're putting points into your abilities in order to maximize your damage or your utility, and how you're going to see power spikes from levels. Now, if we get rid of all of this, right, we're also going to experience power spikes from items. So there's got to be just like a clear button on here. It is what it is. So you're also going to experience power spikes from items. And they're not going to be, a straight staircase where every step is the same either. And we can talk about Ornn, because Ornn's an interesting champion and a notable kind of exception to this, or his champion's kind of built off of, the unique aspect of his champion is built off of this concept right here. So items in League, you start out, you got your little starting gold and you get some items. But here's something that's important to keep in mind, right? When we go back to base, this is when we're laning, and I'm not going to be able to spell that out. This is when we're in lane, and this is when we're just bought our item in the fountain. And so what's going to happen is we go back to base and we get these power spikes, right? But let's talk about, like we did, the granular level of what's actually happening here. So there are times when your power spike is going to be bigger or smaller. Let's say earlier on, just like with levels, the earlier in the game, the bigger the power spikes are going to be, even if you're not completing an item. Because when you go back and you buy those items, maybe that's not quite the right size. When you go back and you buy those items, you're going to see a bigger and bigger spike because, again, the percentage increase to your stats is going to be massive. So imagine you're an ADC and you have like 70 AD. And you go back and you buy, 2 longswords. I pick bad numbers for myself again here. And you go to 90 AD. Going from 70 AD to 90 AD is going to give you 20 out of 70. That's a 28.5% increase in the amount of AD that you have. So 28% or 29%. That is a big power spike, right? To get when you go back and buy these 2 longswords. So that is a absolutely massive power spike. So these early backs are going to be really impactful, right? They're going to give you a huge power spike. This should tell you a couple of things. It's bad to just imagine you're a player who buys initially at the start of the game and you lane for a long time and your graph looks more like this, right? Someone who doesn't recall frequently enough is going to be outpaced by somebody who also started at the same place, right? So they're also going to go here, but then they're going to stay in lane for half the time, and they're going to recall. And even though they recalled earlier so they don't get the same spike, look at this zone that they've created where they have an item advantage over you. Essentially, what you're looking to do in League is constantly stay ahead of your opponent. And down here on this x-axis, we've got time, right? You're essentially looking to maximize the time that you have an item advantage over your opponent. And so someone who's recalling more frequently, when you go back here, you know, they might be ahead, but look at this. They might come here and they might recall shortly after you. And even though you have this item advantage for this time over them, it's a small item advantage, not for very long. And then they go back and they get an item advantage on you. And so they're looking to maximize their space or their time where they have an item advantage over you. And so, you know, that's really important to keep in mind, but we'll talk about that. So when it comes to early item backs, you're going to have a bigger advantage. So that seems to imply that backing frequently is going to be advantageous to you, especially if your opponent is backing frequently. So essentially, think about it like this. You're racing to continue to stay ahead in power level compared to them. So high elo players back a lot. Like, I recall a lot in lane. I would say on average, I probably recall somewhere around like 6 or 7 times a laning phase, like within the first 15 to 20 minutes of the game. If you don't do that, that's not necessarily the end of the world. I'm also playing support, right? So sometimes I'm backing and looking to roam and things like that. So it's a little bit different, right? If you're playing AD carry or you're playing a solo lane, you might not be able to recall that much. But still, the goal is to recall more frequently than your opponent without losing too much. So anytime you can get a recall off without losing very much for it, like you lose a minion or 2 for it, or you even lose a couple of minions for it, like 3 minions, that is very much worth being able to go back and make sure that you're ahead in gold spent compared to your opponent and that you have this item advantage. Especially early on, when you're first back, just buying 2 longswords represents a 28% increase in your AD or your damage output. You know, and then when we go back, if we go from, let's say we have the same recall, but we go from 90 AD to the same recall, so 110 AD, obviously this is going to be a lower percentage. So, you know, 20 on 90 would be 22% increase. So our increase is getting smaller and smaller each time we go back and buy the same amount of gold worth of stuff. And of course, this is going to apply across different stats. So same thing with health, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to get AD from leveling up. You're going to get health from leveling up. And so you're going to have even more, you know, already when you go back. So you're going to end up with even less of a benefit from buying more and more of it. But the point is that early on, your early recalls and your earliest item purchases, even if they're just components, are going to make a huge difference in your power level, and then that's going to slowly fall off. Now, another thing is, so that would be just going back and buying component items. What about item completions? Item completions are like the equivalent to when you're hitting like level 6 and getting access to your ult, or like when you're hitting, you know, level 2 and level 3 and getting access to an ability. A lot of items, passive or actives, is essentially almost like another ability, or at least increases your damage so much that it's effectively like gaining access to a lot of damage, or like, you know, another ability. So let's say that, you know, throughout this gradual curve, sometimes we're going to have randomly here in a step that should be smaller, it's actually going to be more like this, because you're going to go up a lot. So we'll redraw this. You're going to go up a lot when you complete an item. So let's just look at, you know, I'll try to do my best on drawing this. So we get a big spike, and then a not so big spike, and then a not so big spike, even compared to that one. But then we complete an item and we go back to experiencing a big spike, and then a not so big spike, and then an even smaller spike than that, and an even smaller spike than that. And then we complete an item and we experience a big spike, and then back to these small item spikes. So you're going to see something like this, right? Where this is like first item completion, this is second item completion, this is third item completion, and so on. And you're going to experience, this size of spike on a component is going to be much bigger than this spike on a component, which is going to be bigger than this spike on component, because the percentage increase you're getting, you have more stats at this point later on into the game. And you have, so, the percentage increase that you're getting from buying here is smaller, whereas you have less stats here. So the percentage increase in power level is bigger. So a champion like Ornn's really interesting, I brought up, because Ornn gets to build his own items for himself, his component items, and his, item completions. He can just build them while he's sitting in lane. And so Ornn, how does this change for Ornn? Just as an interesting one-off. Ornn's designed around this. So he's designed so that he gets to have a much, much more frequent, gradual increase in power level. So he's going to experience something much more like this because he's able to sit there and build every time he gets a component. Now, I threw some bigger ones in here because this might be like, I didn't do it quite right, but this might be like his, when he gets his first item completion, let's say. And so he's going to experience, but he's still going to get this, right, based on the stats. So he's still going to have bigger increases. So I didn't draw it quite perfectly, but he's going to have bigger increases here as he's buying his first components, and they're going to get smaller and smaller. So you can see, like, generally this is bigger than this. And then when he gets his first, and his second item completion or whatever, he's going to get big spikes just like everybody else. But you see the difference is in these lines. It's in the time that's elapsed between him purchasing his items. So he's getting to experience these bump ups much more frequently. And so he has a much more linear path up. And yes, you have a linear trend up, but it's not, that you can see how inaccurate this is, because you're often way above or below the trend line, whereas Ornn, the trend line's following much more closely because Ornn's actually getting to pick up those components very frequently. And so Ornn's an interesting champion because he's kind of built around this this concept. So we'll just briefly mention Ornn there. So combining these things together, what we have to understand is that we're going to have power spikes based off of our levels, and we're going to have power spikes based off of our items. Now, there are also certain champions, like we talked about, that kind of have unique aspects to them that change the way that these things work. So let's just think of a couple of champions, but obviously we can't go through them all. Just let's talk about a couple of champions. We talked about how Ornn kind of changes this dynamic by being able to build components more frequently. But there are certain champions, like at level 16, Kayle gets a huge power spike because her E changes, or something, like the way that she's able to auto attack. It becomes permanently ranged. It does a lot of extra damage, etc. Whatever. So Kayle becomes very strong at level 16. Kai'Sa, right, gets kind of interesting power spikes based on when she gets 100 AD, she gets to evolve her Q. And then it does a lot more damage, has an extra bolt. When she evolves her W, when she gets 100 AP, she's able to gain access to an extra passive stack when she hits her W, and like more damage, greatly reduced cooldown or something like that when she hits it. And her E, when she gains 100% attack speed, bonus attack speed, she's able to go invisible on her E, and stuff like that. You maybe gain more movement speed, something. So you might see that Kai'Sa, even if she didn't get an item completion, like here was the second item completion. Let's say that this is actually Kai'Sa's second item completion. Let's see. So for a champion like Kai'Sa, let's say that this is actually like her getting enough AD rather than a second item completion. This is like Kaisa getting enough AD, like 100 bonus AD. And so even though this is a component buy, like getting pickaxe in a Rage Blade or something like that, she gets 100 AD at this point and power spikes up, right, like this, as if she almost completed an item, or as if she got a level or unlocked, a better ability or a huge increase to the power level of one of her abilities. So you're going to see certain champions like Kale, like Kaisa, have certain kind of power spikes that are different than all of the things that we've covered because they're just unique to that champion. Tristana also has a different benefit, which is her range increases based on her passive for every level that she gets. Now, that is gradual, that's per level. So going back to that level graph, she might just get a little bit more of a bump per level than other champions. Certainly, right, the power level, if we think about champions that are good at scaling, why might a champion be good at scaling? Syndra has certain break-even points where she has hit a certain number of shards now from hitting her abilities. She might gain, an upgrade to her abilities after hitting a certain amount of shards, and that might drastically increase her power level randomly, not even at a level spike, not even at an item spike. You might have a champion like Sona who is decreasing the cooldown of her basic abilities every time she gets stacks of her passive, so she's going to get that. Scaling champions are going to benefit more from, let's say, those levels or maybe even those item spikes than other champions. So you might have two champions and they might have the same amount of gold, but one might spike harder when they buy an item because their champion just synergizes better with the item that they have access to buy, or because their champion's meant to scale really well with gold compared to the other champion. So for example, if this was a tank champion who's not really meant to scale that well with gold, and then this was an AD carry, when the AD carry goes and spends the same amount of gold, they might spike a little bit harder than this, in theory anyways, at least, of course. And so when you look at scaling champions, they might either have little gimmicks that are causing their power level to gradually increase at different points. Vigar might be gaining access to AP, not when he's buying an item, not when he's hitting a level spike, but every time that he's getting passive stacks. And so there are champions that are going to experience that more gradual power level increase, or certain spikes where they hit a threshold and suddenly become stronger. And so that's certainly going to be the case. Champion like Kha'Zix gets to evolve, an ability when he hits his level. I think his level 6, his level 11, and his level 16, so it corresponds with his ult, right? But like we talked about, his level 6 would have a bigger spike than your average champion's level 6 because he gets an evolve. His level 11 would as well, and so would his level 16. Those would be big spikes for him. So very complicated, and there's a lot of little nuanced examples here, but more or less what you're trying to do in a game of League is in a one-on-one, so in mid lane or in top lane, or really in any role, but essentially in a one-on-one or a two-on-two, you're trying to maximize the amount of time that you're spending more powerful than your opponent. And so what does that look like, right? If you can get level 2 first, you're going to prioritize getting to level 2 first, because if we add it in, we're basically taking the item, the item chart and the level chart, and we're combining them together, and we're going to get, again, some sort of staired chart that's more in the beginning and gradually gets smaller, but has big spikes as you hit level 2, as you hit level 3, as you hit level 6, as you complete your first item, as you complete your second item, etc. And what you're trying to do is, when you're playing versus your opponent, they're going to have basically the same start, but imagine somebody stays in lane too long, they recall, and they get a slightly higher power level than you, and then they stay in lane too long, and then they recall and they get a slightly higher power level than you, and then they, the problem with this is this player is not spending their gold, and so even with the same amount of gold, you can end up spending like 90% of the game in a power deficit, here, compared to your opponent. And so that's really bad, right? You're wanting to do the opposite of this. You're wanting to put your opponent in this situation. You're wanting to be the one who's recalling just a little bit more frequently than your opponent. If you recall too frequently, the reality is that you give up a little bit of resources every time you recall. And if you don't have the opportunity to recall at a time when you're going to not lose much, you are going to be worse off for recalling than you are going to be for staying. So you're not going to compromise your lane in order to just recall and buy an extra longsword over the person. But if you have the opportunity to do that relatively for free, especially early on, you're going to take that opportunity, even if it's just a longsword. So what you're looking to do is maximize the frequency at which you're recalling for free, but especially try to lane just a little bit less than the other person. So let's say that the average person in your elo or in the game that you're playing, your opponent recalls like 3 times. What you should try to do is you should try to recall every time they recall. And then if you can get a free recall where you lose, like I said, 1, 2, 3 minions or whatever in order to recall, usually it's when you're able to shove the wave all the way into their turret. So you shove the wave all the way into their turret and you recall for free. You take the same number of recalls as them, and then you take as many extra free recalls to get ahead as you can. And then, extra if free. Now, what ends up happening here is this kind of little game, almost a little game theory thing going on, where you want to be recalling more frequently than your opponent. But if you're recalling all the time, right, obviously, if you just say that recall more frequently, the more frequently you recall, the more you have to give up, because you're not always going to be able to recall. And there's going to be a lot of times where you do need to stay in lane and actually farm and gain XP and gain gold. Otherwise, you're not going to get those same item power spikes as them, or or the same level spikes as them. You're going to fall behind, and that's going to be worse because then you're not actually achieving your goal of spending more time being more powerful than them. So what do? It's this game where I think that people recall more frequently in higher elo because as you go up through the ranks, people are going to try to out-recall each other more and more often. And so as you go up the ranks, right, it becomes more optimal to recall a little bit more frequently as you're going up in rank. But you're not trying to recall all the time, but you're not trying to stay in lane all the time. You're trying to just recall every time that they do so that you're never super far behind in items compared to them for a long period of time. And especially if you're ahead of them, you should never be stuck in lane for a long period of time where you're not getting to recall. So now let's talk about how are we going to apply this in game. So if we see that they recalled, right, we need to try to get a recall off. Sometimes we're going to be losing so hard that we don't have the ability to shove the wave out and get our own recall off, or they're going to stay and not let us recall. But at least if they're staying and not letting us recall, we're not like totally doomed. Teleport is going to allow you to make up for this because you can take a really bad recall and then just teleport back into lane and catch the wave so that you can essentially, trade teleport to avoid one of these bad scenarios. Or the more important thing, right, is to just, if they recall, you shove the wave and recall. This can be really good to do if you're behind as well. They need to recall in order to spend their gold to be ahead of you and to create these long periods of time where they're ahead of you. Really, really important. Not just to be annoying, but to actually win games. Stopping your opponent's recall, even if it costs you a lot of HP, is very, very valuable. Because if your opponent is winning lane on you and you are down 1,000 gold or something in lane, they're going to come back with this huge item spike over you, this huge item advantage over you. And they are going to prevent you. They're going to beat you, they're going to outtrade you, they're going to outdamage you, maybe even kill you, and prevent you from leaving this bad situation and getting to spend your gold. And they will keep you stuck like this until they kill you and get even further ahead. You need to prevent them from going back to base at this point and getting to buy their item advantage at all. So you need to stop them from recalling. A lot of times, players just recall slightly out of vision. They just walk back to tower, they walk back to the furthest bush. It's very, very obvious. There's really only a couple of spots people recall. They recall right under tower, right in front of their tower. They recall in like the bush, close to their tower or whatever. Sometimes if they're pushed up really far into you, they'll be recalling in the first bush closest to your tower or the middle bush or whatever. But the point is that there's really only a couple of places that you have to check. And even if you don't find them, okay, at least you looked for it. But if you trade, is it worth it to trade like 1 minion, 2 minions, 3 minions even, to make sure that you stop their ability to recall here, so that you're wasting their time, and all of a sudden that stopped recall represents all of this time period here where they would have had this item spike on you completely cut out of the game. You stop them once, sometimes you stop them twice, sometimes you stop them 3 times, and now they're in a bad spot, and you actually get to get your own recall off, and you can kind of start to mitigate a lot of this bad stuff from happening here. So if you're falling really far behind, it is extremely important to understand this concept and then go into game and make sure your opponent doesn't get to recall and spend their gold. Now, if you're going to kill yourself in order to stop them, that's not going to do much, because you're only going to delay them pressing that back button for 6 seconds or so, and you're going to give them an even bigger gold advantage. So don't kill yourself to do it, but one of the best possible times when you're behind, one of the best possible things you can do is prevent them from recalling. The other thing is, if you're coming back into lane, we see this happen a lot. Let's say somebody's overstaying for plates. So they're 1,000 gold ahead of you, but you've just recalled. And so now you're in this window here. They're ahead of you, but you've just recalled, and they've been staying in lane for a long time. When you come back into lane, you need to punish them for having overstayed to take that plate by stopping them from recalling and all-inning them while you're on full HP, full mana, just bought full items that you could buy, and they're still sitting on 1,000 gold. Because somebody could be 1,000 gold ahead of you, but if they haven't spent it, they don't actually have a lead on you. So somebody could be 1,000 gold ahead of you, and if you're able to come back into lane and stop them from recalling because they just left to go recall right as you're coming back into lane, or they got, and so they're like a bush or 2 away from you. If you just go check it, they stayed too long to take a plate or to hit the tower or whatever, or to shove the wave in and they just didn't realize they didn't have enough time to do it. Whatever the case may be, if you're coming in fresh off of an item buy and full on resources and HP and stuff like that, and they aren't, you need to punish that situation and take advantage of it. Too many players let players just recall right in front of them slightly out of vision because they're in a bush or because they're just out of vision range, when if they just stop them from recalling, they'd mitigate a huge amount of the time that they spend. And especially in low elo, players won't understand how bad it is that they're not getting their recall off when they have a lot of gold. So players tend to overstay with 1,000, 2,000 gold. If you can get them to take the time period in which they had 1,000, 2,000 gold, and you can delay their recall and waste half of this time they would have had, first off, you're going to get to spend half as much time actually playing versus someone with an item advantage on you, even though you messed up and were losing or something bad happened. But also, keep in mind what we said earlier. The earlier the purchase is made, the more impactful it is, because they won't have had as many levels that they're building onto with their stats, and they're going to be getting that power versus someone else who's also earlier in the game. And because League is a very snowbally game like that, and item purchases earlier matter more, preventing them from getting to spend 2,000 gold at 10 minutes and them instead spending 2,000 gold at 13 minutes actually makes a big difference in how strong they're actually going to be, or how big of a power spike or increase they actually get when they do get a chance to spend that gold. So really important when you do have a lot of gold, when you are winning, you are ahead, to protect your recalls, get good recall timings, make sure you're spending your gold. Do not overstay and fight somebody multiple times in a row when you could just go back and get a guaranteed item advantage and then win for free off of that. And if you're behind, don't let them recall, especially not right in front of you, especially if they're not overstaying. Take your opportunity to potentially even all in them or fight them if they overstay for a plate or to push the wave, and you're coming back into lane at the same time that they're walking out of vision. Because chances are they're recalling right in the middle of the lane, right in front of you out of vision, or in the bush, right to the side of you, that they first walked into when they went out of vision. A lot of times, this is another very important thing. When you see them exiting, right, when you lose vision of them, they're going to be walking into the fog, right, into the fog of war. When they're walking into the fog of war, pay attention to what direction they're walking in. Are they walking in a straight diagonal line at the first bush that's closest to you? Are they walking in a diagonal line straight at the second bush? Or are they walking in a diagonal line straight at the third bush? Or are they walking towards their turret straight back, or to the middle of the lane? If you pay really good attention to where they're leaving, you're going to have an idea almost always of where they're recalling. It's something that, even a lot of good players just don't do. When you're thinking about recalling, you want to get your recall off as quickly as possible. So rather than walking straight back into the lane, and then once you're out of vision, swinging a right or taking some diagonal and going into a bush to conceal where you're recalling, what most players do at almost every rank, even in like Masters, is they just immediately click the spot in the bush they want to recall in. They walk in a straight line there because they're trying to get their recall off as quickly as possible because they know how important it is to get it off, and they recall. And a lot of times, how many times have you done it? Have I done it? How many times are we sticking our recall, so to speak, where somebody is literally like 1 inch or just a slight face check into a bush away from catching us and stopping us from recalling, which would lead to a really disastrous situation. Us not getting to spend our gold, them being fresh off of a back, and us being half HP or whatever, or even lower, about to die, just sitting in a bush. People are sitting ducks, so look and fish for stopping people's recalls as frequently as possible. It's especially important on support because at least in top lane or a mid lane, you can make the argument, well, like I said, I'm going to lose 1, 2, 3. I start to lose 4 CS, 5 CS looking for the guy. That starts to not be worth it. The more CS we're losing under turret in order to get there when we get back. But support doesn't even have to CS, so your AD carry can be catching the wave and you can hold them in lane to help your AD carry get that. So it's especially important on support because you're one of the few roles that can do this for free. Now, okay, so we get the idea. We're trying to maximize our time that we spend with an item advantage by making sure that we're actually recalling when we have any sizable amount of gold to spend. And the earlier the game, the bigger the power spike is going to be, even if we're only spending a little bit of gold. So even if we only have 300 gold, 400 gold, 500 gold, if we're 5 minutes into the game, that's a great recall to have because it's a big item advantage over the other person. This is one of the reasons why, like the, wave 3, shoving the cannon wave in if you have full control over the wave, recalling is actually good, which would call like a cheater recall. It's not as good as it used to be, but one of the reasons why that's so good is because you get to take that longsword that, we were doing 2 longswords before. So let's say you get the 1 longsword and it's instead of 28%, it's a 14% power increase, right, to your AD or to your damage output. That's a huge advantage. You also get to fade a gank, meaning that if they were going to gank you, around wave 3 or so, which is, usually right when a jungler would come to either early gank you, if they just did 3 or 4 camps, or, by the time you get back, they're probably finished with their full clear. So you're going to avoid a lot of gank windows. So you're avoiding a lot of gank windows that can potentially happen to your lane, especially if their jungler's pathing towards you. And you're getting that item advantage, even though it's just a longsword. It's 14%, from 70 AD to 80 AD is a 14% increase in that power level. Very, very big. Doesn't have to be a longsword, right? That's just an example. Could be boots, to be able to dodge more skill shots and gain 14% effective HP by dodging a bunch of skill shots or something in lane, or being able to trade better or chase somebody down more. It might lead to a kill, whatever. Or it could be a ruby crystal making you, 14%, 15%, whatever the case may be, tankier. You get the idea. You're going to get a big increase from that, and it can be very important. Now, essentially, And this is where things start to get really complicated. You will never be able to actually like calculate this out, but I will describe it, because I think it's important to understand conceptually. All of your champions on your team. So imagine you have 5 of these graphs, right? All of your champions on your team are going to have 5 different. Let's say this is your support down here. I mean, this isn't quite fair, right? Support champions are actually very strong for the amount of income that they have, but they have low income, let's say. So you have 5 of these different graphs. They're drawn very poorly here. But your team actually has 5 of these different graphs, because you've got 5 different people doing, 5 different varying degrees of well in the game, or poorly, depending on how you want to put it. Glass half full, glass half empty type of person. So you've got 5 different actually progressions going on. So your team's power level, right, is going to be kind of like an average between these two, or between these 5. But, there are going to be points here where, let's say, everybody just recalled and bought an item, or everybody's got their first item completion, everybody's got their second item completion, or maybe your person who's most behind on your team doesn't have your second item completion, but everyone else does. What you can essentially look to see is, what are the points in the game where my team has kind of recalled at the same time or gotten their item spikes at the same time? When is my team the strongest as a whole? And again, very, very difficult to calculate. So you're not going to sit there in the middle of a game when you've got decisions to make in a game to play and calculate, okay, we're this average level compared to their team's average level. And, we've got all these items and they've got all these items. And this is exactly how strong this item power spike is compared to this item power spike. But what players, and especially at a high level teams, actually do, especially professional teams, is they look to fight objectives when pretty much everybody on their team has first item and the other team doesn't, or when everyone on their team has second item completion at the same time, but their team hasn't gotten to second item completion. Essentially what they're doing is they're saying, we only have a 2 or a 3,000 gold lead, but we want to as a team, but we want to maximize how big our gold lead actually feels, and we want to maximize what we're trying to take on the map when our gold lead is its strongest. And when our gold lead is its strongest is when we've all spent our 300, 400, 500 extra gold of our 3,000 collective gold advantage each to finish our first item or to finish our second item while they're still sitting on full components. That's going to give us the biggest advantage. And so we're going to look to force objectives or force a team fight at that time. When we have all of our ultimates up at the same time, when we have all of our item completions and they don't, that's when we're going to look to force a dragon. That's what really good professional teams will do when they're talking about playing around power spikes. They're not able to take everything into account. Sure, one champion, X champion at level 6 is going to be stronger than another champion at level 6. Maybe Kaisa buying first item is different than a Jinx buying first item or something like that, right? You're not going to be able to calculate the exact thing, but you just have a sense for, these are the champions on my team, these are about the levels that we are, these are about the item spikes that we're at, this is when we can go for it. In solo queue, right, unfortunately, it's too discoordinated, and so you're not all going to be completing items at the same time. Usually some person's really far ahead and some person's really far behind, instead of them being closer together, in a less aggressive, more controlled, let's say professional game type setting. But you're still going to have these times when, hey, we're in solo queue, everyone on our team happens to have ult for dragon. We can take advantage of that and look to do it. Whereas a lot of times, right, the reality is that, and this is something that's important to keep in mind, let's say another power spike might be having your ult off of cooldown versus it being on cooldown. If dragon's up in 30 seconds and you use your ult and you don't manage to kill somebody, or you used your flash 2 minutes before dragon's up or whatever, all of a sudden you're going to be at this power disadvantage compared to the other team when you're actually looking to fight as a team. And so even if you get one kill from it, if they respawn and then they're at the dragon and their whole team has ult and you're missing ult and flash, all of a sudden you're at a disadvantage over a more important fight. And so it's difficult to coordinate in solo queue because you do want to take the advantages that you're given. But the more competitive and the more controlled of an environment you're going to get in League, the more it is better to be patient and wait with the power that you have and save all of those tools, whether it's summoner spells, whether it's item spikes at similar times, taking that recall, right 30 seconds or a minute before dragon to make sure that you all have your item spikes beforehand. You're going to try to coordinate and use those advantages in order to put the other team in a totally losing scenario, even if you only have a small gold lead on them. So that's basically the idea. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. That is power spikes from levels, from items, from obviously certain unique champion passives / like scaling mechanics or whatever, or gimmicks or whatever you want to call it, or mini games that they get to, and how you can kind of coordinate as a team, or how you can maximize your time 1v1 or in a 2v2 lane and bot lane to spend more time actually having a gold advantage or a power level advantage over the other team. And yeah, so that's power spikes in League. Hope that you guys learned something. Hope that you guys enjoyed. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.